Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 9th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Jim Clausing, Matt Kaiser, and Tony Tortorici. And I'm, of course, John Hogaboom. So we're going to jump in with our first story today. And I think, Jim, you have this one. It's something about some analysis on another APT threat.
Thanks, John. This report came out in the last week from a group of security researchers in Luxembourg. They took a look at a group of actors in China that were using some of the same tools. In particular, the poison ivy was one of the tools that they were using for their remote administration. And did some interesting analysis of what these guys were doing and how they were doing it. In particular, they did some of the same analysis that we've done, paying attention to when the actors are active and mapping it to working hours, concluding that, in fact, they do believe these guys were in China based on the hours they were working. But then they also did some other analysis that was kind of interesting. They managed to crack the password for the administration page and were able to get in and take a look around and see what they were doing, some of the machines that they had taken over. There's a lot of good stuff actually in the report, and I don't have really time in this segment to go through a whole lot of it in detail, but any of you that are out there interested should take a look at the report.
Yeah, you know, I also had taken a look at this report, and I'll echo that it's got a lot of interesting tidbits, especially some of the techniques the good guys use to try to figure out what they're picking up here. Poison ivy is something that, you know, it's a freely available tool, but we do know that some of these state-sponsored actors have been using it for malicious purposes. And it's hard to tell. When I read the story, there is a lot of tools that overlap. They use some additional tools, especially kind of an HTRAN one. But we know that a lot of actor sets use those. So they're using a lot of the same techniques as well as the APT1 actors from the Mandiant report. But I do kind of think it might be a different actor set, especially since a lot of the tools that they're using there are freely available versus some of the other ones we see, which are not as readily available to the public, which I didn't see in this one. So interesting story. Definitely I would take a look at it, and I'm going to kind of talk about that a little bit more in detail in my top concerns later on at the end of the show. But, thanks for pointing this one out, because it actually slipped by my radar until you actually mentioned it earlier in the week here to me.
Yeah, the consensus among the other security researchers that I've talked to is that this is a different group from the ones that were highlighted in the Mandiant report. But yeah, there's some good stuff in there, some signatures for some of the other tools that they were using and some of the other malware that they were dropping. So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, and go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
One of the things that I enjoyed is that the appendix is full of code that they wrote, the researchers that is, including a Metasploit plugin, which is, as soon as a good guy finds an exploit, it immediately makes it into Metasploit most times, and also a plugin to brute force the encryption algorithm Cadelia, I think it is, or Camellia, I may be saying it wrong, written for John the Ripper, which is a popular cracking tool. So these guys not only gave us the intel, they gave us the tools that they used as well. So I appreciate that.
And another thing that I just remembered is they do mention a lot of the file names that they drop as well on the infected machines. Some of those are not normal file names that you would see. Some are Windows file names that you might need to rule out. But one of the things I would recommend is if you do have SMS or any kind of file auditing in your enterprise, to maybe go see if there are any machines in your enterprise that have these on there as well. There's a lot of tools that are publicly available, but you might be kind of wondering, well, why would a person in my company have, GW secdump or whatever it is. There's some like password dumping utilities, things like that probably you wouldn't have on your machine, or an employee wouldn't have on their machine unless they perhaps were penetrated and an attacker left it on there. But they're usually pretty good about cleaning up, the attackers, that is. So you may or may not see it. But that's one thing that we've done in some other investigations is to look for kind of breadcrumbs left behind on infected machines like that.
So John, what you're saying is maybe have a rolling SMS job running, looking for administrative tools that shouldn't be on most of the PCs that are sitting in someone's network?
Well, perhaps, but they might not even be identified. It depends on whether they'll be classified as a known kind of potentially unwanted program, so to speak. Some of them might not even be well known enough that they are. But I would just kind of go rummage through your SMS database and see if you see any of these file names and or these MD5 checksums, or sometimes SMS doesn't keep that, so you'd have to go look for like the size of the file and stuff like that, right, and then maybe take a closer look. But it's something that I would look into.
Yeah, and one of the other things, I'm glad these guys included some of these indicators of compromise that we can go look for in our environment. There are some reports you'll get on some types of malware that there's not enough detail there for you to even tell whether there's any kind of, whether that infection exists in your network. So these guys didn't provide necessarily everything we might want of that, but they do provide, file names and MD5s and those kinds of things that you can look for.
Right. All right, great. Thanks for that one. So the next up on our roster of stories here is Tony. I understand using some of these translator services, there's something going on there with links via them?
Yeah, what's been going on out there, and what this article was dealing with, is how spammers are using different techniques to get past spam filters. And one of the techniques that they're using, and we're seeing a lot of it now, is using translator web pages. We're constantly seeing URL shorteners being used, which points to a legitimate site that it's hard for some spam filters to actually go through the redirection to see what the root website is. So now they're using the translation pages as well. So it's just another tool in their toolbox to get past spam filters. And what this article discussed is how it's kind of like a sleight of hand when it comes down to what the spam filters are seeing. And what I got from this article is, since it's another tool, you can start stacking these on top of each other, and it's just going to make it even more difficult. You could start, you can go way back and say that, spammers were using hacked legitimate websites, which that would circumvent some of the spam filters, and then you put URL shortening on top of it, it would circumvent it even more, and then now with translation pages. So what the article was discussing is how some are using translation pages, pointing to URL shorteners, pointing at hacked legitimate websites, and it just gets to the point where it's nearly impossible to really track down what's going on unless you go and you crawl through all of the websites to see what and where it's going to. So it was a really interesting article, but it just keeps reinforcing that every time we come up with a new tool to stop them, they're going to find a new way to get past it and get their email right into your inbox.
Right. So it almost sounds like they're kind of using these web translator, and I'm assuming it's like a language translator service.
Yeah.
Kind of like a proxy in a way, so that if I was to see a machine talking, I would see it talking to one of these, publicly accessible translator services, and I might think it's benign because it's a well-reputable company, et cetera.
Exactly.
They're getting a translated page from something that might have some instructions in there that don't get translated or something to that nature, right?
Exactly. The first thing that the spam filters see is a legitimate website, which would be, translate dot whatever, and that one is to be a known legitimate website, but it actually moves on to something that isn't so legitimate.
Right. And very interesting. Yeah, like you said, they're going to keep finding new ways to obfuscate their activity and make it harder for us to track down. So I'm surprised they didn't figure this out sooner, or somebody hasn't tried this sooner.
I was reading an article back in 2009 that was an intelligence report, and it stated how they were using it back then, but to get their spam out to a bunch of different countries, a bunch of different languages. But it isn't until recently that they decided to use it to trick the spam filter. So in the beginning they were using it to, I'm going to send this out, and this package is going to do it in French, German, Chinese, so on and so forth. But now they decided to step it up and just start tricking filters with it. So pretty slick.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. Did somebody else have something there?
Yeah, sorry, John. I was just thinking it reminds me that more often than not, we're going to start seeing more legitimate sites getting pulled into these kind of campaigns. I mean, hack sites are one thing. I mean, we had the CBS.com, what was it, NBC? I forget which, but there was a major website recently that got hacked and uses a redirect to malicious stuff. And it's probably I wouldn't say the easiest way for the bad guys to get around URL filtering, but it's one of the most effective. I mean, if something is already whitelisted, I mean, what are you going to have to do? You have to keep an eye on all your favorite whitelisted websites to make sure they haven't suddenly gone rogue.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so next story, back to you, Matt, actually. We've had some more private keys leaked for code signing.
So that's the way it appeared at first. There's a little bit of an involved story behind this. So there was a security researcher, Brandon Wilson. He found an unsecured FTP web server in Taiwan, unsecured FTP server in Taiwan belonging to let's say, a partner of American Megatrends, or AMI. If you're a computer aficionado, you'll probably recognize AMI as a well-known vendor of PC hardware, particularly for BIOS and firmware, and the UEFI new BIOS standard. On that server, there were internal company emails, Norton Ghost disk images, photos of printed circuit boards and specs, Excel documents. But worse than that, there was source code for AMI firmware, which is something that we would rarely ever see, that was current apparently as of February 2012, so not that old. And on top of that, there was a signing key for the Ivy Bridge firmware architecture. Now, when this came out, people immediately assumed that this was a signing key for production code. Now, if you're not familiar with firmware signing, when firmware is signed cryptographically, it means that the chips that it runs on can validate that this is proper firmware based on who signed it. So typically these keys stay private so that only the person who is legitimately allowed to sign and run code can sign it. If this gets out in the open, that means anybody can sign the code, and it's pretty much game over for anyone trying to keep unsigned code or inappropriate code off of these chips. When it was released, people assumed that it was a production key. Wilson's partner, Adam Cotto, posted about the leak on his blog, and AMI contacted him, cleared things up. Turns out the key is only used to sign test firmware, according to AMI, and if vendors are abiding by their instructions, firmware signed with this test key should never be seen in a production environment because they would have changed keys from production to test. But the burden really lies with the vendor in order to do this right. So I think we still have to wait a while to see if this is case closed or not. The other thing is that the AMI source code is still out in the open, and it's kind of irrefutable that is kind of a security issue as well. So if there's any vulnerabilities in that, those will probably come to light in the near future.
Right. Yeah, so that was my concern, too, is that the source code is out there, and you could look for weaknesses in the code because you'd have the source. I guess my question is do they have an explanation, or did the article explain how this stuff ended up on this FTP server? Was it accidental, or was there some other kind of activity where some insider exfiltrated it, or they were compromised by an APT or anything like that?
I believe it was just a case of poor security on the case on the part of that partner. It hasn't been confirmed by AMI who the partner is, but there are some threads on Reddit that suggest it's a company called Jetway. But from what I understand, it was just pure poor configuration on their part.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, again, we always talk about this. This is a little bit different than some of the other ones, but when we talk about BIOSes on your computer, that is about as low as you can get into the machine itself. So being able to compromise the BIOS would be a bad thing. It sounds like the key situation might be under control, like you said, but the fact that the source code's out there might be a little troubling. And like you said, I guess this is another one to keep an eye on and see how this story unfolds over the next couple of weeks if there's any more information there.
Definitely.
Now, just to, I got a quick question about it. With the keys that you were discussing, is that to prevent the BIOS to get rootkitted? Is that the method behind the madness for signing the BIOS?
That is the idea, is that since you're operating at such a low level in the system, if anyone was able to overwrite that code, they would essentially have root access beyond the operating system. And in a case like this, if a machine was, someone had written malicious code and, reflashed the firmware so it's rootkitted like this, I mean, if you would run your AV, you'd see nothing. If you had wiped all of your disks, you'd still not get rid of it. So this is pretty permanent. Unless you're really looking hard for it, you're not going to find something like this. So this is like a holy grail if you can get at it.
Right. I don't think there's any AV antivirus in the world that would be able to pick up a BIOS type infection. Right. It's too low level. It's at the lowest level you could ever get at in our current architecture of computers. So, interesting and troubling. Hopefully it's not going to turn into anything to really worry about going forward, but I guess we'll see how it unfolds. All right. So with that, we're going to jump to the Internet Weather Report. And not a whole lot going on here. A lot of the same stuff we always see. So first one we have here is we got some increased scanning on 8118 TCP, which is associated with Privoxy, HTTP proxy, which is a proxy software. It probably is somebody looking for proxies. I'm not 100% convinced of that. It could be that there's some other web-based service that some other software package is using on port 8118, but somebody is aggressively scanning for it. It's primarily one source in the United States. This same source had done a kind of quick poke, very aggressive scan back around, I guess this is April 1st, April 2nd time frame, and we don't really see any activity. And then they started to do more continuous, ongoing scanning since yesterday into today, from about April 8th into the 9th here. So that's one to keep an eye on. If you have any services that are Internet-facing, listening on port 8118 TCP, keep an eye out for that, especially if you're running Privoxy. I don't know that that's what they're searching for, but I would venture to guess it's something HTTP-based that they're looking for there. Next one, this one's unassigned. We've seen a couple of spikes with this. So there is kind of a noise floor, I'll say, of scanning on 6675 TCP. And on occasions, we've seen some spikes here. And the past day and a half or so, we've seen two pretty significant spikes up in the 6 million flows per hour, actually scan flows per hour. And it's a small number of sources, less than 10 in China. They look related. They're in the same kind of address block, so I think they're coordinated, whatever they are, even though it's a small number of them. And what purpose, I don't know. 6675 wasn't able to actually dig up anything other than, I think there was one particular piece of malware. Some botnet might have used this as one of its ports at some point, but I really don't think that it's related to that. I think this might be something else that I'm not quite sure what it is yet that they're looking for. But if you have any knowledge of this, please let us know. or an explanation why somebody might be scanning on this port, or any other legitimate uses that people might be using it for, that would be helpful too. And 5902 TCP, we've seen some increased scanning on this one as well. And this is the last 15 days shown, again, as the other two slides were as well. This 5902 is generally an alternate port for VNC, Virtual Network Computer, which is a remote desktop type of software. We've talked about it quite a bit. There's a single source in France that's been aggressively scanning this in the order of 3 million scan flows per hour, doing very strategic scans in certain address block ranges, looking for anybody listening on that port. So probably these are attempts to find and identify VNC-enabled machines that are internet-facing, and usually after that point they start trying to brute force their way and do brute force password guessing on those. I would highly guess that 5902 is a VNC type of thing, even though it's an alternate port, only because I saw that same source also scanning on 5900 TCP, which is also VNC. So I'm pretty sure that that's what he's doing here. And I don't know if he was responsible for this spike earlier 2 weeks ago, but these most recent ones here that are pretty aggressive, that was this single source in France engaged in that activity. And so to the pie chart here, the top 10 most probe ports we talk about all the time. The 16,000 range ports here are related to the zero access botnet. That's its peer-to-peer protocol that it uses. It's not very smart about how it uses it. It just kind of scans everything out on the internet trying to find one that will answer. So it's pretty noisy. 445 TCP, that's Windows file sharing. There's Conficker is infected with, or related to that, as well as a bunch of other botnets that exploit that vector. 1433 TCP, Microsoft SQL Server, could be brute force password guessing or other types of vulnerability attacks on that. 22 TCP, which is SSH, we see that all the time. That's definitely brute force password guessing is probably going to be going on there. And same thing with 3389 TCP, Remote Desktop Protocol, as well as 23 TCP, Telnet. And 3306 TCP is MySQL Server. That's probably, again, I'm going to guess it's brute force password guessing as well going on there, although there might be some vulnerability I'm not aware of that they're also looking for on there, because I'm sure there's ones on some of these database ones for older versions and whatnot. So if you're using any of these protocols and services, of course, like we always say, filter it to only people who really need to access it, using a firewall or IP tables or something. Something's better than nothing. Don't expose, especially these administrative type ones like Telnet and SSH and Remote Desktop Protocol. Don't expose them to the world because we see that all the time, these brute force password guessing attacks on those services. In terms of the most sources probing, so the previous was the most total number of probes, so one guy could do a whole bunch and it would show up on this the previous chart. This one is more in terms of the number of actual IP addresses engaged in activity. We see the zero access ones kind of jump up higher in this case because we have a lot of hosts engaged in this activity. So these four ports here in the 16,000 range UDP are related to the zero access bots all trying to chatter out on the internet there, trying to find each other. Nothing else really unusual here. 80 TCP may be a little interesting. That there's a lot of scanning apparently going on for 80 TCP. Not sure what that would be other than they're just trying to identify web servers or maybe perhaps find vulnerable websites. We know that there's some botnets out there which are searching for certain vulnerable instances of content management systems that they can compromise and then turn that web server into a bot for their own purposes. So if you have a web server of your own or for your business that's internet-facing and it's running any of these public content management systems, or even any other software that you might be using on there, make sure you've got it patched and up to date and security patches applied to that stuff. Too frequently we see a lot of people deploy stuff and they just let it go for years and years and never patch it. And they just assume it's going to be okay. Or they assume that their vendor whoever is providing their web hosting to them might be patching that software, but that's usually not the case. So something to be mindful of.
John, just thinking back to the previous pie chart, the most probes, and TCP/22 SSH, it's a standard one. We see it all the time, but it came to my attention in the last week or two that there's a research group in Germany that has been doing some scanning, looking for SSH, doing it in such a way that they're not actually attempting to authenticate. They are doing it to identify SSH servers, and there's been some debate on various mailing lists about the ethics of that, and I'm not going to go into that, but just to be aware that some of these, we do occasionally see some of these scans that turn out to ultimately be benign, but they can be annoying. So.
Right. And, to that point, particularly with SSH, if I remember right, when you make a connection, or when your SSH client makes a connection to an SSH server, the first thing it spits out is its version, its software name and version.
Yeah,
and a lot of attackers will try to enumerate those to look for certain vulnerable versions they know about. So if they can get a big list of these together, and like I said, unless you patch all your stuff on a regular basis, you might get on some bad guy's list of, hey, this guy's running a really old version of SSH that there's an exploit for.
Yeah, and I think these guys in Germany were collecting those version strings, doing kind of a census type of thing.
Right.
Again, I'm not going to get into the ethics of that, but it's just to be aware that it is going on out there, and we've noticed it in some other places.
All right, that's great. So some of this activity could be related to that research activity as well. So good point, or good note on that. And we had talked about on the pie charts here about zero access. I always like to kind of bring up a nice colorful chart towards the end. And we're actually approaching the 1-year anniversary of this particular, now zero access has been around for maybe 2 years, I'm going to guess, something like that. But this P2P variant that they created, where they use this kind of peer-to-peer protocol for communication, really emerged towards the end of April of 2012. You can kind of see that here where right around, or maybe it was very early May. So we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary here, and it's kind of stayed up and not really gone away. So I've said this before, I'll say it again. If you have any ability in your enterprise for your company and firewall logs, just look for lots of outbound connection attempts on these ports, 16464, 16465, 16470, and 16471 UDP. If you see like one host that's making thousands of requests to these types of ports, outbound UDP, he's probably a zero-access infected host. Beyond that point, it could get tricky in terms of cleaning it up because depending on the version, it does some master boot record type infections. It can be very painstaking to clean it up. You basically have to completely wipe the hard drive and really completely wipe it. So just another reminder to those viewers out there to take a look, see if you can find any of these in your network and clean them up. I've never really, maybe the next thing I should do in here is kind of identify what ASNs or what pockets of the world are really showing the most infections of this, because maybe it's not even in the U.S. I haven't really checked, in which case I'm preaching to the wrong audience, but because I think most of our viewers would be in the United States. But we'll take a look at that for next time.
We need to get together a group like the Configure working group was to try to root out all these infections and kill them off.
Yeah. And, this one is one that, while it is very noisy on our network, it doesn't really cause the victim very much pain. It's mostly a click fraud-based one, so it's trying to click on web pages and advertisements in order to generate revenue. So really who they're defrauding, they're using infected machines to defraud advertisers and to get money. There are some other Bitcoin mining operations and things like that Zero Access is engaged in, but in general it's not, I guess maybe it hasn't got as much heat in terms of remediation because it's not being really used to commit a crime directly against the infected user who owns that machine, whereas the Zeus and Quackbot, some of these other botnets that are trying to steal login credentials for your banking sites and other websites and then use those to commit, monetary crime, probably get a lot more attention than this one would. So, and I guess I'll get off my soapbox on that point. So, top concerns for the week. I don't know if anybody has any. I think, Jim, did you have a top concern for the week?
Yeah, my concern this week is another in my ongoing concerns about IPv6 and how ready the community is to deal with attacks that come over IPv6. This one came to my attention through an email to the Internet Storm Center where I volunteer on my own time. And it basically what the reader there alerted us to was an issue with spam. And there are real-time blacklists out there to block known spammers. But it's not clear how many of the known spammers have IPv6 addresses and whether the real-time blacklists handle IPv6. In this case, it looks like a known spammer sent the email over IPv6 to a major webmail provider, and it got through. You remember that most systems, if IPv6 is enabled, prefer IPv6 to IPv4. So in this case, when sending the email, they had IPv6 enabled on the sending system, so it's connected to the webmail provider. And so, again, my concerns with IPv6 and how ready we are as an industry to really handle attacks over it. This is another one that I hadn't thought about until this week. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that concern. IPv6, I don't know how ready we all are, and once everybody really comes down to once people start adopting it en masse, we're really all going to probably be playing a catch-up game in terms of, getting these IP block lists and other things together to help, have, an equivalent mapping that we would have for our IPv4 type things. And God help us all for trying to remember IPv6 addresses. IPv4, I can look at one and pretty much tell you what part of the world it's in. But IPv6, it's not going to be that easy to keep track of them in your head like we have been.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to one of my issues a couple weeks ago is that any given machine can have multiple IPv6 addresses, so it isn't like you can simply firewall off one. To block a particular host, you may have to be blocking a /64 subnet. So.
Right.
Did it get into any discussion on exactly how it got through using IPv6?
No, other than that particular address wasn't on the blacklist, and the other spam filtering didn't happen to catch this one.
Okay.
I think a lot of hosts use, or a lot of botnet operators use infected hosts as their spam senders. So as soon as these infected hosts, their ISPs, start adopting IPv6 more, I could see that this is going to become more of a problem where your victim machine that's sending the spam is got IPv6 enabled, and the receiving and SMTP server or whatever has IPv6, and they're just going to talk that way, and nobody's got block lists, or there's less of a block list management going on in that IPv6 space. Yeah. Exactly.
A lot of these blacklists, include the ranges for home users for various ISPs. The IPv4 ranges for ESL users. Those ranges get put into the blacklists, and a lot of the places won't accept email directly from them. They've got to go through their ISP's SMTP servers. But again, what are the ranges for the home users in IPv6?
Right.
And are those known yet? Probably not. So.
Right. That's a big concern, because a lot of the first steps in spam filtering, the perimeter of it is blacklists. Are you on it? If you are, drop it. It doesn't have to do any process time on analyzing the email. It already knows that it's garbage. So this is definitely going to be a concern in the future.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for that. We'll all keep our minds in the IPv6 space and the threat that's there. I have a concern for the week. So the thing I've been thinking about is, if anybody's familiar with the Mandiant APT1 report that came out, it did have a lot of information in there. I think that was back around the middle of February it was released, and now we're in April, so about 2 months later. What we had observed is that actor set, from our perspective, kind of went very quiet after that report came out. We're starting to see a small uptick in activity related to the same kinds of tool sets used in that report, and I don't know if you haven't already looked at it. I would highly recommend taking a look at that report, especially Appendix C, which kind of talks about all the malware families involved and the various tools that they use. It's very interesting, especially if you do malware analysis, to kind of connect the pieces between maybe activity you've observed before and some of these malware samples that they talk about. But that being said, my concern is that I expect that these guys, these adversaries, have probably been retweaking their tools, changing them, and we as security analysts should be mindful to start thinking outside the box more so than ever, and to expect the unexpected in this space, because I highly expect we're going to start to see things that we haven't ever seen them do before, using different techniques and different tools. So keep an eye out for that. If you find any, you can always send us a note and let us know what you've been seeing, as long as you're allowed to do so. That's one of the areas that we investigate, along with just the botnet malware and whatnot. All right. I don't know if anybody had comments on that after my soliloquy there.
You're right. It's an arms race, and they'll always keep adjusting their tactics once they know that we're aware of them. So.
Right.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So that is our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter at ThreatTraq, and the ThreatTraq video is available at att.com/ThreatTraq and also on YouTube, and you can subscribe to our audio-only feed on iTunes. So I want to thank Matt and Jim and Tony for joining me today. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.